session 4 of our little journey through the book of Esther. I have given you on the outline some general comments on the book of Esther and on this portion of Esther, and there were some that I read this week, namely in a book that I mentioned down there for you, Unusual Bible Interpretations of Ruth, Esther, and Judith. Does anybody know what the book of Judith is, by the way? It's a Jewish apocryphal book. Even the Jewish people don't consider it part of their Tanakh, the Old Testament, but it would be like the book of Maccabees or something like along that line. And this fellow, Israel Drazin, has written. He's Jewish, and it's completely from a Jewish perspective. And so I would say I don't recommend the book. It's full of unusual Bible interpretations, as the book is called. But if you're one who can chew the bones and or chew the meat and spit out the bones, it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it anyway. He is certainly not someone who holds to the scripture like you and I would hold to the scriptures, so you have to take some of that with a grain of salt. But he mentions some interpretations that I think are worthy to bring up, some related to chapter 3 and others just related to the book in general. The first one I wanted to mention is Martin Luther. I think you've heard of him, of course, and the Jewish people certainly have heard of him because he hated them. He was quite anti-Semitic. And Martin Luther did not believe that the book of Esther belonged in the Bible because it, in his words translated anyway, it has much pagan impropriety. Much pagan impropriety was Luther's words. Now, Luther probably, if we were to dig into that and ask him a little more, and I'm not sure about this, but probably he was saying that, there's no God in here, and we've already talked about some of the paganism, haven't we? It's a weird way to find a wife, don't you think, in that little circus beauty show that's going on. So that kind of pagan impropriety is probably what he's talking about, and there certainly is that in there, and we've already talked about that some. I kind of wonder if he didn't like the book because he was so anti-Semitic. And in the end, it's the Jewish people that get saved. And Luther said, you can look these up, it's not hard to find his anti-Semitic statements. Luther literally said that Jews, you ought to take away their passports, don't let them travel, burn their synagogues, don't do any business with them, all this kind of just very anti-Semitic stuff. In fact, one of Luther's favorite fans was a fellow named Adolf Hitler, who built a sort of religious kind of anti-Semitism, even, might I say, Christian kind of anti-Semitism, if I use that term quite loosely, against this. Now, while I'm there, just because we're there, talking about Luther, you might know that on October 31st, 1517, was the day that... That's right. Put those 95 theses on the church wall and started what's called today the Protestant Reformation. Now, I happen to believe that those of us who are Baptists are not really Protestant. The Protestants are those who were part of that movement that protested and they pulled out of the Catholic Church. I think that Baptists can trace their roots, more of their stream of thought, in people who were separatists all along, like the Waldensians and some of those people that were really never in the Catholic Church all along, and the Baptists came out of that particular movement. Now, I put on Facebook, I think it was yesterday or today, I'm not sure, probably yesterday, I put a little statement that said, while I'm appreciative of what Luther got started in 1517, 499 years ago, I would not go to a church where Luther was the pastor. There's so much about his theology that I would just look at and say, no. Beside the fact that Luther killed people who baptized like we do back in that day. So all of that just to say, this is free stuff. It doesn't even have to do with the book of Esther. But one of the, I think, fallacies, Todd and I were talking about logical fallacies the other day. One of the fallacies that we have is someone says, well, Martin Luther said, blah, blah, blah. And so he said, oh, well, it must be true then, must be right. Or Calvin said, blah, blah, blah. Or Randy White said, blah, 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 whatever it is. And really we have to go back to, well, what does the scripture say? Regardless of whether it was Spurgeon or D.L. Moody or whatever it is. And sometimes we get annoyed with people who are name droppers, but preachers like to be name droppers, especially name droppers of dead preachers. So I'd just say when we drop those names, all we can tell is that's what Martin Luther said, or Calvin, or whoever we may have been talking to. Then going on in that little list, there were many Jewish rabbis that really felt the same as Luther, not because Jews are anti-Semitic, but they said it was really kind of an ungodly book. The Persian king is mentioned 190 times, directly or indirectly, and God doesn't get any mention at all. So they looked at that and said, this book needs to be out of here. Obviously, they didn't win that argument, but there were many who thought that. B.W. Anderson, I didn't look up his credentials, but he says, and I agree with this, to the Jew, the book of Esther dramatizes the eternal miracle of Jewish survival. And we'll get to a verse here that highlights that, so just file that one in the back of your mind. A.E. Morris, again, I don't know his credentials, taught that the book of Esther was not written in the time of Esther, back in the late 400s B.C., but rather was written much later. And A.E. Morris would be like a lot of Christians, actually, a lot of Christian theologians in the seminaries. You don't find very many of these in the church unless they came from the seminary. But the seminaries often teach, well, those books were written hundreds of years later. And then they teach that the story of those books didn't really happen, but it was a story that was made up in order to teach some moral principle. And so there are a lot of Christian theologians and Jewish theologians, all on the liberal side, who would say the book of Esther was written, this guy says, in the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes he's often called, was the one who slaughtered the Jews in the days that led up to the Maccabean revolt, or the Hashmonean, or the Hanukkah story that perhaps you know. And this fellow was teaching that the reason the book of Esther was written was to show Jews that if you will go along to get along, you'll survive. And that was the view of the Hellenistic Jews. Remember, in the New Testament, you got Hellenistic widows and whatnot. There are these Hellenistic Jews, and Hellenism is related to what? Greece, that's right. And of course, Antiochus Epiphanes was head of the part of the Greek Empire, what was left of it by then. So the Hellenistic Jews said, go along to get along. And you could see how someone would say, Esther is kind of a good picture of a Hellenistic Jew. She's gonna make this work. And so there's some who say this story was just made up for that regard. This other fellow, he gives an interesting similarity between Moses and Esther. Both Moses and Esther were adopted. Both kept their identity a secret for a time. Both were initially reluctant to help their people. Both fought against Amalek, which we're going to talk about tonight. And both ended up seeing their enemies defeated. Now, this fella here, Gerleman, also says that the story was made up, and it was based upon the Moses story and just sort of a new spin on that. Now, all of that is nothing but unusual Bible interpretations of the book of Esther. But it is also to say there's a bunch of different interpretations of Esther, but let's look through here and see a number of things about this and spend a few minutes on Esther chapter 3, verse 1, which says, After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. Now, I need to stop and talk about this man Haman, because this is the first introduction of Haman. Haman, the son of that guy, the Agagite. Agagite's what I want you to catch on. Because the Agagite, if you take that little gold string right there and keep it in Esther so we can come back, and then turn backwards to the left, that is, to Numbers chapter 24. In Numbers chapter 24, 22, 23, and 24, you have the story of Balaam and Balak. And Balaam is the false prophet, if you will, the prophet for hire. And Balaam gives this prophecy. This is the one with the talking donkey and all of that. It's one of those stories that is one in which I probably would read it out of the New American Standard rather than the King James. But it comes to part of his oracle in verse 7 says, he shall pour water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters, and his king shall be, what? Higher than Agag. Higher than Agag. And his kingdom shall be exalted. Now, most people would take this as a prophecy of the Messiah. I realize I pick up right in the middle of it, and it's kind of hard to put all that. But Balaam, the false prophet, was hired to give a curse, and you may remember God wouldn't let him give a curse. Every time he opened his mouth, a blessing came out. Part of this supposed to be curse is there's going to come a king, he says, who is higher than Agag, and this kingdom shall be exalted. You look through that, and it looks very much to be a prophecy of the Messiah, and I think ultimately is a prophecy of Messiah. But there is a chance here that verse 7, this king will come that is higher than Agag. Now, the real perplexing issue is that Agag, the king, had not even been born. In fact, it was going to be several hundred years before Agag was born. So here he comes, and Balaam is saying the coming king is going to be higher than Agag. Well, it's not terribly unusual that a king be predicted in advance by a prophet. Cyrus was one of them, Cyrus that allowed the Jewish people to go about 250 years, I think it was. Before Cyrus, Isaiah called Cyrus by name and said, he's my messenger, God's going to use him. So it could be that Balaam, the false prophet whom God is using to give this blessing, is prophesying of King Agag, who is not going to come until the time of Saul. So that's a long time. Here we're in the wilderness. We got to get to the monarchy after the period of Judges, and get King Saul. Now, there's another possibility, and that is that Agag it's not necessarily a name. It's a title. Like Pharaoh is not his name, obviously, but it's a title. In this case, Agag there and Agag here, it's all, you might say King of Kings. He's going to be King of Kings in that sense. But there's also another possibility, because there are several times, and I think this one's interesting, there are several times that word higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. Let me back up just to make sure you're with me. Maybe Balaam is saying Messiah is going to be better than Agag, who is going to be the biggest king in terms of strength that the Amalekites are ever going to have. Now, currently, Balak was the king of the Amalekites, and Agag was going to be the king of the Amalekites. So he says, your kingdom's great now, Balak. Your kingdom's going to get even better under Agag, but there's going to be one who's even better than the best of your kingdom. That's kind of the typical understanding. But then there are a number of times this Hebrew word higher in the Old Testament is actually not translated higher, but it's translated taller. In fact, that probably is the more natural understanding of it. He's going to be taller than Agag. Now, who was it? If you've been listening really closely through this very confusing story, who was it that fought Agag when he finally did show up? He was the first king of Israel, Saul. And what is known about Saul? He was taller, head and shoulders above the rest. He was a tall man. So it very well could be that this is a specific prediction of King Saul and Agag, that here's one who's going to be taller than Agag, and his kingdom, that would be Saul's kingdom, shall be exalted. Now, it's still messianic ultimately, but it would stop and talk about Saul in the beginning of the kingdom there. Now, this actually does tie into Esther, I promise, here in just a moment. So here we have this Agag. Now, later it is King Saul. So in the time of the book of Numbers, Moses goes up against the Amalekites, and Balak is the king of the Amalekites. Later on, hundreds of years later, Saul goes up against the Amalekites. And Samuel the prophet and the priest says to Saul, you go get the Amalekites and do what Moses didn't do back then, and that is kill them all. I mean, with the Amalekites, I think probably stronger than any of the other, shall I say, ites? The Hittites and the, well, termites and all that. Samuel was just unbelievably strong on kill the Amalekites whose king is Agag. Now, Saul came in and he killed the Amalekites, except he saved their king. And their king was a man named Agag. And Agag, he had him locked up, but he kept him for some political purposes. And Samuel came along, and that great story you may remember. Samuel came along and said, King, did you kill all the Amalekites? And Samuel said, yeah, I killed all the Amalekites. He was supposed to kill all their animals, their sheep, their oxen, their people, their babies, everything. He was supposed to kill them all. And then he asks Saul that question. Anybody remember the question? Yeah, what's this bleating of sheep I hear? That's bleating with a T. Why do I hear bah, bah? And Saul says what? You're very close. Yes, we thought it would be a good idea. The reason he all of a sudden becomes very religious. We want to give a sacrifice to our God. And so we got their sheep to give a sacrifice unto God. We're going to kill these sheep ultimately, but we'll give them. Well, it turns out he saved the sheep and some of the other good stuff, and he saved the king. And Samuel, the Baptist pastor, literally hacks him to death. It's a brutal kind of a story in the Old Testament. We look at that and we say, what's up here? Well, I have this little theory. I can't totally put it together. But Agag was the son of Anak, and Anak and the Amalekites, I know there's all sorts of names coming here, but Anak, we know, was one of the Nephilim. And the Nephilim, if you go back to our Noah's Ark story, the Nephilim, my theory is the Nephilim are this polluted race of part fallen demon, part human, trying to so pollute the race that the Messiah could not be born. That was the reason for the flood, and if you remember from that series a long time ago, we thought we got rid of them all, but there was this hint that there were some there, and even in Genesis chapter 6 it says the Nephilim were there before and also after. So somehow they made it through. I had my theory back then, we'll go to it, but we'll go to it another time. But here, Anak is a Nephilim. Now, pull all this together. I think what we've got is that Haman is the very last of the Nephilim that we have shown in the Bible. And we're going to end up with Haman being killed and all of his sons being killed. Now, were there others who lived past that? I can't tell you, but I think there's a decent, at least, argument to say Haman was one of the descendants of the Nephilim. Was he a giant? Probably not, but by this time that DNA had been pretty well watered down, but nonetheless it's still out there. And so we have the death of Haman, in which when we get to the end we're all going to rejoice over it. In fact, if we have our Purim party, we might have the little what are the things called that are the picture there, the Hamantas. We're going to celebrate Haman's death by eating those things. The parties and all that they have really is a celebration of Haman's death and the survival of the Jewish people. So I just want you to put in the back of your mind here, and I know that this is a lot of time to spend on this, but I think in Haman we've got a spiritual root on the wrong side of spirituality, but a spiritual root that goes back to the work of Satan. And it is that work of Satan that hates what God's doing among the Jewish people, that the work of Satan is going to say, if I can get rid of Jewish people, even when they're out of the land and not really being obedient to God, I want to do it. I want to get rid of Jewish people whenever and wherever I can. And so Haman is a part of this satanic stream that is going all the way through there. Now, again, I can't prove all that really. I can just say there's several dots here, and if you connect the dots, it seems to work. You have to question that assumption, obviously, and work on that yourself. But here is the Haman, the Agagite, and the Agagites were Anakim, and the Anakim and the Amalekites and all this kind of stuff comes in together. And I might add that not so much on the Nephilim, but on Jewish tradition also, it is that Haman was very much the descendant of Agag and the descendant of the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites, by the way, were Semites. By Semites, we mean what? They were Edomites, that's right. So the Edomites, today, we would call Palestinians, that's right. And the Palestinian people are really, if we wanted to use modern terminology, they're Jordanians. And Jordan is the home of the Edomites, and the father of the Edomites is a fellow named Esau, and the father of Esau is a fellow named Jacob, that's right. So, to put all this out on a lot of confusion on verse 1 here that goes underneath the surface there. But the Arab people came from, not exactly, go back farther. Ishmael, that's right. The Arab people came from Ishmael, which was the son of Abraham, but then, you know, it was Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Isaac had Jacob and Esau. And that little Esau line is where the Edomites or the modern-day Palestinians come. So, in a sense, they're all Semites. So, you could say, as Israel Drazin does in his book, that Haman, he calls him the first anti-Semite. I really kind of disagree with that because what about Pharaoh and all that kind of stuff? But he says the first anti-Semite was a Semite, and because Haman was certainly an Edomite here. Now, that all is actually going to come up to the surface later, so that's just under the surface stuff. So, welcome to Bible study tonight. Now we come, and we come into verse 2 with that little background that is given and under the surface kind of stuff. So, it says, all the king's servants that were at the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did he reverence him. So, a little something kind of interesting here. Everybody's bowing down to Haman, and the reason they're bowing down to Haman is? King said so. That's right. Now, something interesting here, and again, we have to go into a little history to make our assumption here, because the scripture doesn't actually say this, so again, take it and scrutinize it. But from everything we know from Persian history, if you were a part of Persian royalty, people bowed down to you anyway. So the fact that the king is commanding people to bow down to Haman tells us that Haman was not Persian royalty. And obviously, if he's Edomite, he's not Persian. So here is Haman, who's very well respected by the king, so much so that the king says, you know what, when I walk by and my family walks by and the prince and the princesses and all that, everybody bows. But when Haman walks by, they don't bow because he's not Persian royalty. I want him as a part of my family, so to speak. I want him to receive the same kind of respect. He is respected in my administration, and so I want people to respect him. And so he gives this command that he be bowed down to. We don't really know anything other than the command. In fact, this is the first time we've seen Haman, and he's somewhere between chapter 2 and chapter 3. He's promoted to a pretty prominent place in the kingdom. And they say, hey, I want everyone to bow down to him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Now, why did Mordecai not bow down to Haman? I wanted to say at first he didn't bow down because at least he was a little bit Jewish. And to bow down to someone else would be, I'm thinking Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they won't bow down to the idol because that would be breaking the first commandment. And I really kind of wanted to go there. The problem is that bowing down to somebody really doesn't break Jewish law. You see it a number of times in Scripture. In fact, you see it quite a bit in Scripture, even with Jews bowing down to others. One of the places I think of just immediately is granted pre-law. But you remember when Joseph's brothers came to him in Egypt, what did they do? They bowed down to him, exactly. So bowing down is not inherently breaking Jewish law. But here is Mordecai who says, I'm not bowing down even if it's the king's command. It really is a little bit of civil disobedience here, isn't it? And I happen to think that you see civil disobedience fairly often in the Bible. I don't think that right here you can build a doctrine of civil disobedience. All you can say is Mordecai was civilly disobedient. And I do think there are some places in the Scripture you can go that we are to obey God rather than men, and you can put that together if obedience to God hinders obedience to man. But honestly, we don't know why Mordecai didn't bow down. Some of the Jewish people say that Haman had actually little idols on him to pagan gods, and so if you bowed down to Haman, you were actually bowing down to those gods. And that's a great story, but it's not in there any more than some of the other things. Yes, sir.
Don't we have to possibly assume that Mordecai would bow down to the king? I mean,
that's a very thank you. That's a very good question. Do we possibly assume that he bowed down to the king? And there's nothing in here that would really, as much as he went along with the king on the whole thing with Esther, you would think that when the king walked by, and he seemed to have some kind of access here, not immediate, but if he's around the harem and all that, surely he saw the king at some point. So I would say it would seem that he probably bowed down to the king, but he's not willing to bow down to Haman. So there's another Jewish myth and legend that says, this one's totally, I think, myth and legend, that Haman used to be Mordecai's slave, and then he freed him, but he wasn't going to bow down to his former slave. And maybe his former slave had idols on him too, I don't know. But, the point is, he wouldn't bow down to him. And if we indeed do have Mordecai somewhat understanding somehow, even though I don't think Mordecai is this great Jew, I think he's Jewish, but I don't think he's very faithful. If he's understanding, this is Agag, and I know the whole story here, and especially if he's understanding spiritually, I know what's running through his blood, so to speak. I am not bowing down to that. There seems to be something that Mordecai very rigidly is going to say, if I bow down to someone else, maybe, but I'm not going to bow down to Mordecai, to Haman. And so he bowed not, nor did him reverence. In a sense, again, this is another one of those places where the book of Esther never really gives. I sometimes wish it would, because I do it on its behalf. But the book of Esther never gives commentary, pro or con. It's just the facts, and here it is. He didn't bow down. You might even put this again with, say, the Apostle Paul, who talks about, obey the king and do what's right. And here's this guy disobeying the king. And that's one of those things where if you're going to build a doctrine, you better be careful how you mix some of these scriptures. I am one that teaches you don't build a doctrine based upon historical incident. And this is a historical incident. It's not a teaching. So we really can't teach anything about how we should respond to government or not respond to government. It's just that's what Mordecai did. Verse 3 says, Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said to Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? So here they're wanting to know why. And it's a good question, isn't it? That's what we're asking. So, same question, verse 4. Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him. Who's they? The king's servants, that's right. So when the king's servants spoke daily unto Mordecai, kind of makes it look, doesn't it, like Mordecai is one of the king's servants. Certainly there's some kind of close relationship. We've seen him again with the harem. We know he's, the last chapter closed out how he had heard about this assassination plot. He somehow has a position where he's hearing all this. And he's talking to the king's servants every day. We may get to heaven someday and find out he's the delivery boy, delivers pizzas or something. I don't know. But somehow he has a connection here. So the king's servants, which were at the king's gate, said to Mordecai, I already did that, verse 4, and it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, Mordecai did not hearken to the king's servants, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. Here's the first time that this comes out public, really. I'm a Jew. Maybe he's saying, I don't bow down to him because I'm a Jew, and he would have to have then some kind of connection that here's the reason I can bow down to the king, but not to Haman, or here's the reason you're saying this. But now he's connecting it to his Judaism, and he's bringing this out for the first time in a public way. So in verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then Haman was full of himself, full of wrath. Verse 6, he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Now, to me, this looks like, again, I'm reading between the lines a little bit, but it looks like Mordecai was not alone in his refusal to bow down. But what is happening here is Mordecai's not bowing down. They don't know that Mordecai's a Jew. So they're saying, Mordecai, why do you not bow down to Haman? And he finally comes out and says, because I'm a Jew. And then they say, oh, I get it, because none of the Jews will bow down to Haman. Now, again, it doesn't say all that in there, but I think there's enough, it implies that this is a Jewish thing not to bow down to Haman. Again, it's not a Jewish thing not to bow down to anybody, so there's some issue with Haman that Jews are saying, we are not going to bow down to him. So now they know he's a Jew. They know that the Jewish people, it appears, are not going to bow down, and so Haman is going to just take care of all the Jews. Now, some say, and they might be right, some say that Haman is just taking out on the Jews what he felt for Mordecai. That's a little different position than I'm taking. I'm saying he realizes the Jews are all with Mordecai, and Mordecai's with the Jews, so he puts them all together and carries it out. But there's been a lot of anti-Semitism down through the years that has been directed on the entire people because of what one person did. So maybe that is the case, but I kind of think all the Jews are going along with this. So he thought it scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, and he wanted to kill all of them. Now, let's see how he carries out his plot and brings about the king's decree. In verse 7, it says, in the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus. Now, the 12th year of King Ahasuerus is the 5th year of Queen Esther. So she's been at it 5 years now, and this is the month of Nisan, the first month of the Jewish year. Says that, in the middle of verse 7, they cast Pur, that is, the lot. Now, the phrase "the lot," of course, the lot is what? Dice. We'll call it dice. and they're casting the lot. Now, that word, the lot, is used, I put it on the outline, I don't remember, a whole bunch of times in the Old Testament. But this word pur is never used in the Old Testament except for the book of Esther. That's why it actually says there, they cast pur, that is the lot. Because you wouldn't know what pur is unless he told us. It's the lot. Now, pur happens to be the Persian name or the Persian word for the lot. It became kind of a Jewish word because Purim is plural of pur. And so they were casting pur here in this first month. And it says, let's see, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day and from month to month to the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. Now, for 12 months, they're casting pur. We don't even know what this means, honestly. Does this mean for 12 months they were playing poker? Maybe so. I think, again, I'm reading between the lines here a little bit, but I think they're doing this almost like a Ouija board. They're waiting until the Ouija board says, now is the time. Because you've got a 12-month period from the time that Haman realizes Mordecai and maybe all the Jews are not bowing down before Haman ever goes to the king. And they're casting lots this whole time. I think what they're doing is going before their pagan gods or going before their demonic gods and saying, when is a good time for us to go to the king? Now, no paganism, of course, would take place in a world like this today, where someone would consult some astrologist kind of thing to figure out when they're supposed to do something, right? That's ancient Persian stuff, not modern American stuff. We wish. So they're reading the tea leaves, they're checking the stars, they're casting the lot to try to figure out when is the time to go. And they go through an entire year here. In verse 8 it says, Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, now looks like they get the go-ahead. He says to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people, notice he doesn't reveal their identity. There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom. Now, this is cunning on Haman's part because it's sort of a they, instead of some specific group of people. But that is true, isn't it? There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom. Yes, there is. Obviously, we know he's talking about the Jewish people, and they were. They were dispersed. This is what we would call the Persian diaspora, but the ultimate, the diaspora actually began in 722 BC when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom and scattered them about, the 10 tribes that we often call the lost 10 tribes, scattered about. And so here is part of the Persian diaspora, and the Persian diaspora, just if I can be political, how's that? Maybe even political for just a moment. The Persian diaspora actually lasted from the time of Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC until it came to an abrupt halt in our lifetime beginning in 1979. Because in 1979, what happened? Not quite that. What happened in Persia? Iran. The Shah was Persian. And Jimmy Carter pulled the rug out from under him and caused every trouble we've had since then, basically in the Middle East, in my opinion. And the Jewish people then, of course, the Shah was replaced by the Ayatollah. And the Ayatollah had a hatred toward the Jews, of course, and began to exterminate them. And beginning at that time, the Jews fled to where today, through the old Persian empire, there's just a handful of Jews that live there today. In fact, if you go to Israel, you should, maybe in December, and if you go to Israel today, you'll find a whole bunch of Jews that say, I came from Iran, I came from Iraq, I came from Yemen, all that. They lived there for hundreds of years with the Muslim people alongside, really, for the last 2,000 years in relative peace, honestly, until 1979 and the Persian Persian diaspora came to a close and they all have fled somewhere. I had a friend who was, he was not Jewish actually, but he was from Iran, and when I first started talking to him, I remember, and I was friends with him because he ran the Whataburger, when I first started talking to him, I said, where are you from? And his answer was, I'm from Iran, but I'm Persian. And I found that in Houston, there was a lot of them. I found that always they would say that, I'm from Iran, but I'm Persian, to say, I'm not that, I'm not what you think of an Iranian, I'm different. And there certainly was this change. So here they are in Persia, they are scattered about Persia and dispersed among the people of all the provinces of the kingdom. And going on verse 8, he gives another truth. Their laws are diverse from all people. Okay, that's true, isn't it? Their laws are diverse, like the law of the Sabbath. They have these things they do that are diverse from all people. This is one of the unique things about the Jewish people, is they were scattered abroad and dispersed among all the peoples of the world, but they always kept their identity. They were always unique, they were always set apart, they were always different wherever they were. So this is very, very true. And then he, based upon that truth, then look what he says. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it's not the king's profit to suffer them. Don't let this happen. They don't keep the king's laws. Now, that's where the king should have questioned the assumptions. And he should have asked a few questions. A very simple question would have been like, which people and which laws? Give me some more detail here. But isn't it easy? I've been caught up before, and you've probably been caught up before in this, to hear, there's these people out there, and they do this and this and this, and they follow you. They lead you along on something to where you're yes, 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 yes. Oh my goodness, it's horrible. These people don't keep the king's laws. The truth is, there was one of the king's laws that these people were not keeping, and that was to bow down to Haman. I don't know the king, and maybe if he knew that, he would have still said, well, that's too bad, it's my law, and we're going to go with it. But he did kind of change his mind later, didn't he? So I have a feeling if I went before that king and said, these people don't obey the king's laws, and he said, what are the king's laws? Well, you made everyone bow down to me, and they're not bowing down to me. I think the king probably would have said, oh, grow up, put your big boy pants on and get over it, right? I don't know that for sure. Again, I'm doing a lot of speculating tonight here. But he just leaves it as this horrible crime that they don't obey the king's laws. And he should have done a little digging and asking some questions here. I remember, again, I'll tell you one more time, I was talking to O.S. Hawkins one day and about some issue and trouble that was going on that I happened to be involved in because I was on a committee that I'm glad I'm not on anymore. And I asked Dr. Hawkins about it because I knew he was somewhat familiar, though he wasn't on the committee, and he said, Randy, remember, it's an awful thin pancake that doesn't have two sides. Ah, okay. You mean there's more to this than I know. And should have dug in and found this out. Let me tell you, I'm going to say something that I know almost nothing about. But I have been on Facebook the last few days and noticed that everybody has checked into South Dakota for some pipeline issue and water and Native Americans and all that. And I also figured out a pattern of who's checking in there and know which side of the fence they're on. And all I can say is, I don't think I'm going to get involved in a pipeline argument in South Dakota because there's probably a big story there that, I don't know all the issues that are there. And you could just put the bait out there, that there's a group of people being oppressed by the government or by big oil or whatever, and their water is being poisoned. Oh, that's horrible, isn't it? But is that the truth? What's the whole story there? And I talked about this, I think this week on our Ask the Theologian program. I wish we had a very simple world, but we don't, do we? It's not black and white. I mean, we have to deal with these tensions in our life that we can't go. So the king here should have asked some questions. I'm out of time. I'm gonna land this plane. Yes, sir.
One thing we got to assume, though, is there has to be possibly a strong trust set up between Haman.
Good point. Good point. Todd said there has to be a strong trust that has been built up here. And clearly, if you're going to make a law that says bow down to this guy, you have some respect for him yourself. And so he's honoring that trust in a sense, and in a very strong sense, Haman is abusing that trust that is given to him.
He had no justification in what he did to Queen Vashti.
Yeah, he wasn't.
He just didn't obey.
The king wasn't.
Comes along the second time. Oh, he's not obey. Okay, you're done. He seems to be pretty quick with,
Yep, very good point. Yeah, he does seem to be, shall we say, trigger happy. Yeah, the queen didn't do what she said. The women of the kingdom are going to start smoking Virginia Slims and take over, and so he immediately puts her out. So it does seem to be somewhat his personality. Haman probably understands this is his personality, and whether he's reading the tea leaves or whatever it is to figure out when's he kind of in the mood. I'm gonna catch him there at that time. And he carries this out. I think this is one of those stories where I'm not really sure we got a good guy in it. There's a lot of Washington D.C. going on in here, isn't there? And all that being carried out. So he says in verse 9, and I'll bring this to a stopping point, if it please the king, let it be written. I'll just say something right there. If it please the king. This is what you call flattery. And when you want something from someone, you always, I just want to make you happy, whatever it pleases you. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring into the king's treasuries. That is a little hard to read and understand and interpret, and people go two ways here. It looks at first read like Haman is saying, I personally will pay 10,000 talents to the one who's able to do this, 10,000 talents of silver. And that might be what it's saying, but as we get down to a further verse, the king's going to say, okay, give him the money. So I think what my interpretation is, if it please the king, let it be written that the king says they should be destroyed and the king will pay 10,000 talents. Again, it's a little challenging to understand that. But, it says in verse 10, the king took his ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said to Haman, the silver is given thee, given to thee, the people also to do with as it seemeth good to thee. Looks like the king's paying the bill for this to happen. So we'll pick up in verse 12 next time when the decree goes out to the country, and then we're going to see the Jews as how they respond to this particular decree as we come into chapter 4 as well. Next week, and good discussion on Thursday nights. If you care to join us live or on the archives, we are in Song of Solomon. And I think this week we're up to chapter 3. If you want to hear a love story, that's the one. Let's pray.